Steve, we'll also take your perspective on the number one ranking. Were you surprised? It was thought to be that LSU had the resume and Ohio State had the eyeball test as being the more complete team start to finish every game. But I think there was a little nugget unveiled during the college football playoff selection show that Ohio State actually has a stronger strength of schedule than LSU. And I don't think many people would have believed that.
Well, I think they're very comparable. I don't have the records of all the opponents in front of me. I did do a survey to that effect a couple of weeks ago, and obviously they've each played maybe another team since then. And at that time, Ohio State's opponents had a better record. And again, I don't know how much that's going to change. Obviously, it'll help LSU to play an Alabama team that is undefeated if they're able to hand them their first loss. A lot going on this week with Alabama playing LSU, Penn State playing Minnesota, two matchups of unbeaten teams that may have an impact on the top five, going to shake some things up, obviously. I was not surprised Ohio State was number one. I believed that it was a toss-up between Ohio State and LSU for the top spot. Ohio State has the best combination of offense and defense of any team in the country against a quality schedule of the unbeaten teams. Both of their units are in the top 5 or top 10 offensively and defensively. LSU's defense is not quite up to snuff. We were debating this, talking about among the reporters today after our media session with Ryan Day, and I did not watch the show. In all honesty, I had something else I was working on that night. We had other people from our site covering the show. But one of the reporters mentioned how Ohio State's schedule ranking was like 9th and LSU's was 20th. And what was said to me by one of the guys who actually participated in a mock playoff selection committee event a year or two ago was they don't consider 9 to 20 as a major difference. For lack of a better word, those two teams would almost be considered in the same cohort or very comparable, because out of 130 teams, a difference of 10 spots isn't really all that much. What he said to me was, you honestly have to go and hear the presentation, because they have to show you how they do this, show you how the bread is made, as opposed to actually tell you or explain it to you. They use all these different metrics. They have a proprietary metric system that they use, that they pay a stats company to construct for them. And they're looking at 10 or 15 different categories across the board. And maybe they've whittled it down to the top 10 or 15 schools. And then it's color coded across there with where each of these teams rank. Let's say green, yellow, and red. Green for good. And I'm just simplifying the explanation. And red for not as good. And he said what's apparent to him for Ohio State to be number one is that they looked at that board. There were a lot of greens where Ohio State was concerned across there, and maybe not as many greens for LSU. So whatever they're using, and I personally tried to do my own a couple of weeks ago, and I used the human polls. I used Sagarin. I used strength of schedule. I used the opponent's record, and I used the offense-defense comparison. I go back to Oklahoma, top 5 in offense, 40, 50, 60, whatever they've been in defense, and you get blown out. You're not a playoff team. At least you're not going to win the playoff. So you need to have a good offense-defense combination. If it's all the same across the board, I want the team that has shown they're very good on both sides of the ball. And I think that's part of what they're looking at as well. So long way around the bend. I personally had LSU and Ohio State almost in a dead heat. Ohio State has got the better combination of offense, defense, played a slightly better schedule. LSU has the marquee wins: Auburn, Florida, at Texas, and potentially, I'm jumping ahead. I'm sure the next question is, what do you think is going to happen? If LSU somehow goes into Alabama and wins, I would have no qualm with them going to number one over Ohio State, even if they beat Maryland 55-0, because to me, that would be the single most impressive victory anybody in the country has had this season if they pull that off. So I think that's what we're looking at. I think the winner of that game goes to number one if it's Alabama or Ohio State. And then Ohio State, in a couple of weeks, if Penn State's undefeated, would maybe have a chance to get back on top. That could be a 2-versus-3 game in a few weeks potentially, and win that game. Maybe that would be enough to vault them back on top. But again, we're talking about teams that if they win out, they're in, and the rankings today don't mean a thing. You got to finish in the top 4. If you lose a game, you don't want to drop to 15. You only want to drop to 7 or 8. That way you're still within striking distance. If and when the day comes at the end, you're in consideration.
They don't mean anything to a certain extent, Tony, but they give us a clue. The committee unveils some clues week to week.
They do, and Steve mentioned we could have a possibly 2-versus-3 Penn State, Ohio State, and would maybe Ohio State jump back into number 1. We'll see a 2-3 with LSU and Alabama, and we all expect the winner of that to jump into number 1. So there would be precedent there, but we also know with the committee or this ranking crew that precedent only counts as much as they want it to, and they can sort of change things as they go. I was on the conference call after the rankings release, and they were asked, Rob Mullins, the chair, was asked what is the gap between Ohio State and LSU? And Mullins proceeded to say a lot of words, but not give really any meaning to what he was saying. He didn't explain why or how much, what the gap was between Ohio State and LSU, which means, next week that gap could be completely different, and he wouldn't have to contradict himself, because he didn't really say anything this week about why or how wide that is. Now, initially in that press conference, the teleconference, he went through like the top 5 teams and why they were all there. And Ohio State was because of their consistent dominance, and they do have a couple of good wins. LSU was because of their good wins. And so there's some wiggle room there. And I think it will be interesting to see if Ohio State does beat Penn State, or if Penn State beats Ohio State. Do they do what we all expect LSU or Alabama to do, which is go back to number 1 because of that big win that you got there, that quality win there? Because right now everybody is pretty close. And so if you're already super close and then you add another big win, it seems like you would jump forward. And really, as you said, Mark, these rankings don't mean a whole lot, but it tells us some stuff. And oftentimes it can catch the committee in contradictions, which they go out of their way to try to avoid. But because we know how all of this stuff gets convoluted, because this team has beaten another team, and then there's other teams that they haven't beaten who have been beaten by other teams ranked below the top 2 or 3. And it gets in this whole jumbled mess where it's never nice and neat. And so it's hard to keep your justifications clear when the schedules don't remain clear as well, and the outcomes.
I'll be curious to see if Penn State loses a close one in the shoe, LSU does the same in Tuscaloosa, if those 2 outcomes are treated equally. Penn State given the same, and the Big Ten given that type of credibility as the SEC, that, hey, we're just so strong that we can keep teams in the top 4 even after they lose to another top 4 team, especially on the road and especially close, to set up possibly Penn State to get in as a non-division winner.
Does Penn State have the wins to do that, though?
Yeah, I think you've already got your answer to that, because they're ranked 4th and LSU is 2 and Alabama's 3. They're ahead of Penn State, and a 1-loss LSU or Alabama would probably be in ahead of a 1-loss Penn State. I don't know. I guess I'd have to think long and hard about that. And of course, there's a lot of scenarios. 1 loss, but win the Big Ten championship. Does that carry more? If you're, what would it be? 11-1 or 12-1 is a lot different than 11-1. The championship is supposed to factor into this in some way. Not that we've ever seen that they've given a conference champion any kind of credence, even though it's written right there in their bylaws that it's supposed to be, kind of a maybe a tiebreaker type thing if there are two like resumes, you're supposed to maybe give a league champion a little bit more consideration
if you want.
Yeah. It's funny talking with other reporters about this and their impression of what it was almost identical to what you guys were just saying, that or Tony was just saying, that they will take a look at the situation and a set of facts, and they will sometimes build that thing how they want it to appear. It was like Baylor and TCU were ahead of Ohio State the whole way, and then Ohio State beats Wisconsin 59-0, and it was like, guys, Baylor, TCU, we're sorry. I mean, gosh, we're so sorry. We're sorry.
My whole take on that scenario was, why was Oregon and not Alabama included in the one-loss comparison? Why were they given a free pass into the playoff, and Ohio State, TCU, and Baylor had to be the ones compared?
Yeah. It's interesting. And again, another thing, one of the guys we were sitting there who was just pounding the table is like, this is apples to oranges, because it plays such a different mishmash of opponents and these kind of things. And, I don't know that Sagarin, just as I throw him out there, or whatever proprietary thing the NCAA, the playoff, is using to determine strength of schedule and ranking the teams on a computer basis. I don't know whose methodology or whatever is better than anybody else's, but I almost kind of feel like that is something that takes all of the bias completely out of the process. And they did use that in the original BCS formula for a while, and then they didn't like what the computer was spitting back, because it was telling you that teams that didn't fit the eyeball test or weren't going to move the meter were should be in the top 2 or 3, and so they did away with it. But again, I can't attest to the validity of one computer over another, other than to say it's just another piece of information that they can use. And I think the tail wagging the dog this week might be kind of interesting if Clemson. I haven't bothered to look. I know USA Today in the past has had complete transparency on what the coaches have been voting, and maybe they only do that for the last one. I don't know. It's not part of the formula like it was all those years in the BCS. They used to tell you, what coaches voted for who. If there's 7 coaches on this coaches poll panel, and 6 or 7 of those guys have Clemson number 1, just to protect their own, to me, they're the clear number 5. And I think the committee backed that and showed that. And perhaps when the polls come out this week, writers or media people and some coaches who'd been voting for Clemson had more first place votes in the coaches poll, 9-8 for Ohio State. And if somebody, I like to say Ray Charles, but whatever, a blind man can tell you, that's not the case. Based on body of work, based on the fact Ohio State's never been in a position with the opponent running a play that will defeat you if they complete this pass or complete this play. And neither have Penn State or Alabama or LSU. So there's a reason why Clemson, the defending, reigning national champion, 24 straight wins, is at number 5. It's on merit.
But that was a 4-5 North Carolina team, Steve. That was a tough team.
Well, Penn State, obviously, Michigan dropped a pass in the end zone. Pittsburgh was at the 1-yard line. Somebody on Twitter is like, "Did you see the Pitt game?" Like, no, I didn't watch it, and I don't care. They won the game 17-10. Had Pitt completed that play or gotten in the end zone, it may have gone to overtime. It wasn't going to defeat them at that moment. Again, maybe Clemson would have had a few seconds left or a minute or whatever to go down and try and reclaim the lead or whatever, but they would have been behind in the final minute and looking straight at a loss if North Carolina completes that play. And poor Mac. I don't know. If you put a gun to his head and ask him if he'd do it over again, he might want to kick the extra point. I don't know. Take your chances in overtime. But they were playing at home, weren't they?
Yes.
Yeah.
Game in North Carolina.
Isn't the rule that you go for the tie at home and the win on the road?
Although they used to say.
in his first year on the job, in his second time at North Carolina, he's playing with house money to just be in the game in the final minute with the defending champions. So I guess there was some reason why he went for 2 there. But it's amazing how that one moment can cloud what they've done. I give them credit in recent weeks. Since about the middle of that Louisville game a few weeks ago, they've played lights out. So I give them credit. And Dabo Swinney, he's putting that thing together there. They could very well win the national championship. And when these 2 undefeated games are played or whatever, Ohio State, Penn State, and then Alabama, LSU, Clemson's at worst number 3 once all that dust settles if they continue to be undefeated. So they're definitely still in this thing, and we'll go into it. If they're seeded 3rd or 4th, he'll have a chip right there on their shoulder to say they don't respect you, So, it's going to be what it is.
Well, and that win over North Carolina is one of those where, every championship team has one of those wins.
Definitely.
And Ohio State doesn't yet because of their 6 touchdowns. The closest the game has ever been at the time of one of those touchdowns is 10-0 for Ohio State. So there have not been the situations where they have this amazing close win because they're, busy destroying everybody that they play. And they have to, I don't know, maybe they should sandbag a little and come swooping in at the end, but that's not really, that's been the most impressive part about Ohio State this year is how focused Ryan Day has gotten these guys, because we've seen over the last few years that Urban Meyer wasn't always able to do that. And these guys are locked in every single week.
Yeah, that third quarter of that Wisconsin game may be one of the best quarters of football that I have seen against a quality opponent. And you take into account of the fact that they've dominated teams this year in the second quarter in almost every game. But what they did to Wisconsin and just dismantling them in that third quarter was nothing short of breathtaking after Wisconsin got it to 10-7. I mean, by the end of the third quarter, Ohio Stadium was like a 12 on the, out of 10 on the raucous meter, and that's in a driving rain. So it was one of the best scenes I can remember in over 30 years of going to games there, just against a quality opponent, and taking the ball away and converting it into touchdowns, taking the ball away, converting it into touchdowns. Those momentum plays that Chase Young created for them in that game just brought that stadium alive. And what was, a game where everyone's kind of, got their hat on and trying to stay dry and warm and everything. It was a struggle that day.
Yeah, Wisconsin blocks the punt, then they score almost immediately to make it 10-7. Ohio State now, many teams could have started to have gotten tight there. Ohio State ends up scoring their four next drives, scoring touchdowns their four next drives, and just put the game out of reach at that point. And I a few weeks back, maybe a month or so ago, I asked Ryan Day, what's the most adversity your team has faced? And he started talking about they practice tough. Practices are tough. Their adversity happens in practice because there hasn't been any in a game. And so this was their first real adversity in a game. And how did they respond? They went on a 28-0 run against the number 13 team in the country, who you thought had just gotten some bit of momentum, and Ohio State squashed it right away. And then they just continued to pound Wisconsin at that point and kind of reiterate that Ohio State is clearly the best team in the Big Ten, and you're going to have to do a lot better than blocking a punt and going on a 30-yard touchdown drive. And Ohio State's defense right now, as I said earlier, has given up 6 touchdowns. You can look back to see how many of those have come against the first team entirely, and it's maybe 3. There's 2 against Florida Atlantic against the backups. One of those touchdown drives was Indiana late in the first half. Ohio State was up like 30-3, and it was a trick play. Really, there's only been a couple of real touchdown drives against the Buckeyes, and Michigan State had one, and it's been hard sledding for every single team they've faced. And right now, the weather can get tough, and that can play a role against the offense, but the defense will handle it just fine. Ryan Day talked today about, both teams have to play in adverse conditions, and he has built his team on toughness and has told them that bad weather favors the tougher team. And he is, since the winter, has been trying to turn this team into the tougher team no matter who they face. And so they get to the situation where they're good. They're fine with playing in that Wisconsin slop. They'll play in cold weather. They'll play in whatever, because they believe that it gives them the advantage as the tougher team. And right now you're seeing that if the passing game slumps or whatever, the toughness of the run blocking carries them through, the toughness of the defensive line carries them through, and just the overall effort from play to play and not letting up carries them through. And so it's been interesting and entertaining to watch. It's been impressive to watch. And now you just have to get through these next 2 weeks healthy, basically.